only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know. The latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
And welcome to another week of On the Money, where we're focused on the UK's cost of living crisis, helping you to beat the squeeze. I'm Liam Halligan, and for the next hour, we're talking about housing, because we'll be joined live for an exclusive interview with Housing and Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove here on GB News. There's lots of news around. The G7 heads of government meeting in Germany, barristers taking strike action. We'll be covering that, as well as our regular Money Talks interview, today with a Cumbrian whisky distiller. But the focus over the next hour is housing, to both rent and buy, plus our GB News exclusive with Housing Secretary Michael Gove. On the Money, after GB News headlines with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon to you. It's 1 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date today on GB News. Now, G7 leaders meeting in Germany say they will continue working together to meet Ukraine's needs for military and defence equipment. Well, it comes after an address this morning by the Ukrainian president via video link, in which he asked for help with grain exports, reconstruction and military aid. EU diplomats say Volodymyr Zelensky also said he wants to end the war before winter sets in. Well, speaking from Bavaria, Boris Johnson told broadcasters President Zelensky has no option but continue to defend his country from Russian aggression.
There is no deal that the President Zelensky can really do. So in those circumstances, the G7 supporters of Ukraine around the world have to continue to help the Ukrainians to rebuild their economy, to get their grain out, to export their grain. And of course, we have to help them to protect themselves.
The body of a woman has been found in the wreckage of a house which was destroyed in a gas explosion in Birmingham last night. A man who was rescued is in a life-threatening condition in hospital. Witnesses described finding the man trapped against a fridge before helping him out on a mattress. Barristers have gathered outside courts across England and Wales as thousands strike over legal aid funding. They're refusing to accept new cases or to step in for colleagues whose cases are overrunning. Some Crown courts have been forced to run limited services, with criminal trials and other cases postponed or rescheduled. The Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, says the strikes are regrettable and will only delay justice for victims. QC Richard Atkins, head of chambers at St Philip's, read out a statement saying the government is guilty of neglect.
Our system of justice, which is the envy of the world, gradually over time has become starved of resources. Those who practice in crime are treated with contempt by government. Now the very future of our criminal justice system is in jeopardy. It has been abandoned and neglected for far too long.
More rail strikes will take place this week as a dispute over pay, jobs and conditions continues. It's members this time of the drivers' union ASLEF on the Croydon tram link who will strike on Tuesday and Wednesday. That follows 3 days of industrial action, spearheaded by the RMT union last week, in which thousands of rail staff walked out. ASLEF is urging the Mayor of London to intervene after tram drivers were offered a pay rise of 3%. NATO will increase the number of its forces at high readiness from 40,000 to over 300,000. Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg confirmed this to reporters ahead of a NATO summit in Madrid later this week. A summit's taking place in Scotland today to look at ways to tackle an increase in protests outside of abortion clinics. It's the Scottish Green MSP, Gillian Mackay, who's proposed a bill to put 150-metre buffer zones outside clinics, aiming to prevent intimidation and harassment. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, says today's event is an important opportunity to reaffirm women's autonomy and their right to choose. Boris Johnson says changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol could be implemented as early as this year. MPs will vote later on whether to give ministers powers to override parts of the post-Brexit trade deal. The Prime Minister says removing checks on goods travelling from Great Britain to Northern Ireland will help safeguard the Good Friday Agreement. The Shadow Secretary for Northern Ireland, Peter Kyle, says Labour will be voting against the bill as it breaks international law.
2 years ago, Boris Johnson negotiated this deal. He was the one that proposed it to the European Union, insisted it be part of the deal and negotiated it into the treaty. He then said it was a great deal for the British public and British businesses. And then in the manifesto that he stood on, that he drafted and he put to the people, he said there would be no renegotiation. And now they're seeking to break the law.
The government's being urged to invest more money than is currently planned in levelling up the country. There's been a report by the Resolution Foundation that says differences in income are both significant and persistent. Income per person in the richest part of the country, Kensington and Chelsea, is 3.5 times higher than in its poorest part in Nottingham. The think tank says the key to closing the gap is to boost productivity, but it will be challenging and expensive. The Queen's travelled to Scotland for the royal family's traditional week of events. Her Majesty took part in the ceremony of the keys at the Palace of Holyrood House, accompanied by the Earl of and Countess of Wessex. She was symbolically offered the keys to the City of Edinburgh, but returned them, as tradition dictates, to be looked after by the city's elected officials. This is GB News, and I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head back to On the Money and Liam.
And coming up on The Money today, millions of young adults are locked out of the housing market, unable to buy their own place and struggling often to rent. Is this government serious about building more homes for both private sale and rent and for social housing too? We conduct an in-depth exclusive interview with Housing Secretary Michael Gove live here on The Money. Plus, from sidings to silk. Last week, train workers were on strike, bringing much of our rail network to a standstill. This week, it's the barristers looking for higher pay and reforms to legal aid. And each day on The Money features an in-depth Money Talks interview. Today we meet serial entrepreneur Nigel Mills, co-founder of the Lakes Distillery, one of England's leading whisky distilleries. Founded in 2011, the Lakes manufactures single malts, blended whisky, gin and vodka too. So just how good are these English spirits and how's the business doing? We hear from Nigel Mills later in the show. And as ever, I want your questions, opinions, ideas. What do you think of the issues raised in today's On the Money? How do they impact you? Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet @gbnews. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'll read out some of your messages later in the show, so stay with us. This is GB News. I'm Liam Halligan. You're On the Money. The UK has a fundamental shortage of homes to both buy and rent. That's why today's young adults spend more on housing and are less likely to buy a home than any generation since the 1930s. Owner occupancy has plunged among 25 to 34-year-olds from 70% in the mid-90s to 40% now, with half a generation denied the security of home ownership at this crucial family-forming age. While 3.6 million UK homes were built during the 60s, that number fell steadily during the 70s, 80s and each subsequent decade, reaching just 1.1 million over the last 10 years. The resulting shortage of homes and the surge in house prices, which have risen twice as fast as earnings over the last quarter century, is why the share of households renting has doubled. Many claim a lack of building permission is the cause of our chronic housing shortage. Yet 4/5 of residential planning applications are now accepted, and permits to build over 1 million homes remain unused. The problem isn't a lack of permissions, but ever-lengthening delays between permissions being granted and homes actually being built. And for my money, that's because big developers hoover up permits to build, then sit on them, producing far fewer homes than are needed. The resulting supply shortage and pent-up demand keeps prices rising, so developers make higher profits overall by building fewer homes. As well as too few homes to buy and rent on the open market, there's also a chronic shortage of subsidised social housing. Around 1.2 million families are on the council house waiting list, with 500,000 in unsanitary or overcrowded temporary accommodation. This summer marks the 5th anniversary of the Grenfell tower disaster, yet the dearth of decent social housing is getting little political airtime, despite causing serious suffering. Housing Secretary Michael Gove promised to unlock a new era of social housing, reversing several decades when very few such homes were built. Some Tory MPs think new social housing should be part of the levelling up agenda, helping the government retain those red wall seats in the North and Midlands. It needs to stay in power. Housing, though, it isn't about rhetoric or speeches, it's about delivery. More homes to rent, buy and for social housing too. And over the last quarter, the last 3 months, housing completions, the number of finished new homes of all types were 11% down on the 3 months before. And that's our On the Money question today. Is this government serious about building more homes? Grown-up conversations with people who really know their stuff, and the Housing Secretary will be joining us very shortly. I'm joined also by Rose Gray, independent housing consultant and campaigner for On Place, formerly with the housing charity Shelter. We also have our own On the Money regular, of course, Helen Thomas, CEO of Blonde Money. Great to have you with us, Helen, too. Rose Grayston, always a pleasure. I'm about to talk to the Housing Secretary. What shall I ask him?
Well, we've seen some very positive words from Michael Gove. Certainly social housing campaigners that I speak to, charities like Shelter, are feeling much more positive than they have done for some time. But we really need to see some action. One of the things that I would point to is the balance between social rent housing and other so-called affordable tenures in the Affordable Homes Programme. So while in 1996, 75% of all affordable housing delivered in England was social rent, last year it was just 11%. But we all know what we really need is social rent. We need social rent homes where the rents are linked to local incomes because they're genuinely affordable. Michael Gove has talked about doing this rebalancing within the current funding envelope, but we really need to see some action. So that's what I'd love to see you talk to Michael about.
It's interesting, Helen Thomas. I recently watched Michael Gove give a speech at Shelter, not the place you'd normally find Tory cabinet ministers, not least Tory cabinet ministers who've presented themselves over the years as Thatcherite. And yet Michael Gove seems to have really taken on board the arguments from Shelter and other housing campaigning charities. We need to build more social homes, homes that are genuinely affordable, because when developers build affordable homes, that means they have to be 80% of the local market rent or purchase price. And in many, many localities, that is actually completely unaffordable.
Well, I was very interested to hear from the independent consultant there, talk about actually linking it to local incomes, which does sound like a more sensible path forwards. Funny to hear you say, you were linking up Thatcherite to being surprised that they might be working with places like Shelter. I'm not so sure about that. I think, it's a deeply conservative idea to give somebody a stake in society and feel a connection to their local area, whether it is through buying, renting or social housing. So I think there is that's something that Michael Gove, maybe we'll hear from him about that.
Because a social home tends to be for life, doesn't it? You can lay down proper roots. Often kids end up inheriting or taking on the social housing of their parents, or at least getting social housing really nearby. So it does help to keep lower income communities together. Yeah,
but I think, I'll be interested to hear, your opening statistic there shocked me, and I'm an economist, I look at this from big picture stuff. You talked about the number of houses being built. That decline in the number being built versus the growth in population since the 1960s. Astonishing.
Well, I showed the statistics on the graph there, where we built 3.1 million houses in the 60s. We've built just 1.1 million in the 10 years since 2010. And the other statistic, in case the Housing Secretary tries to wriggle out of it, between January and March this year, 40,720 homes were completed. And between October and December, it was 45,610. So that's an 11% drop.
And I would suggest the current supply chain issues on a macro level are clearly feeding into that, both in terms of getting hold of the stuff and the people to build with the stuff. We've got a labour shortage and a resources shortage. So, unfortunately, we are right now in an even worse position for resolving this housing issue.
Rose, before we go to the Secretary of State, and it will just be a few moments, you were at that shelter lecture with me, weren't you? There were many people there, housing campaigners like you, over many years. Polly Neat, who runs Shelter these days, she was praising Michael Gove. He does seem to be quite different from recent housing secretaries, given this focus on social housing, given his willingness for, charities like your former employer and, frankly, for campaigners like you.
Absolutely. I think Michael Gove really gets the problem. He gets the problem, as you set us out at the beginning of this programme, Liam, that we are not building enough homes, and that is not because there aren't enough planning permissions in the system. It's because it will never be profitable for private developers to build so many market sale homes that prices fall. We need to do something else. So I think Gove really understands that problem in a way that previous Secretaries of State have not. That's why there's a lot of hope out there, but we really need to see some delivery.
Do you fear that he's selling you down the river, Rose, that he's talking a good game but not actually delivering?
I think that Michael Gove intends to deliver. I think that he is an ambitious man. I think that he's an incisive politician. It's a question of whether he is able to work his way through the political system to make it happen. These are challenging circumstances in some ways. But I have confidence that Michael Gove is going to try, and I think he wants to see a significant increase in social housing. That's really positive.
Helen, it strikes me that the party that really grabs hold of housing and goes some way towards solving the housing issue, both for people trying to buy, rent at reasonable prices and indeed social housing, will win the next general election and subsequent elections. But it's so difficult to grapple with this question, isn't it?
Well, we've just heard from Rose there about the delivery, just the levers of government you have to get through to get to that point and how long it takes. It's interesting, though, again, from a big picture perspective, housing has been quite a decisive issue in a number of elections throughout the world. Look at the Republic of Ireland.
Yeah, big time.
Where that served Sinn Féin very well to grab onto that issue. And I think, actually, there's a lot of talk about younger people and getting on the housing ladder. I think everybody of every age would like to get a bit more of an equitable distribution. And we should also, at some stage, mention the fact that all the quantitative easing that we have seen has also helped to ramp up
all that money
prices.
printing.
Yes.
As has been said by many political pundits lately, if the younger generation, young adults, have no capital, how can they back capitalism? And on that note, let's now turn to Housing Secretary Michael Gove. Michael Gove, very pleased to have you here on The Money. Your first sit-down interview with the show. You'll have heard some of that previous conversation. We've had Rose Grayston, who you'll know as a distinguished housing campaigner, previously of Shelter. We mentioned Polly Neat, too, also of Shelter. They're singing your praises, Mr. Gove. Are you leading them up the garden path?
I hope not. I want to see more garden paths, as it happens, because we need more homes. We need more homes for people to buy, and we need more homes for people to rent at an affordable level. And that's why we're bringing forward legislation, which I hope will help to unblock some of the obstacles in the planning system, to make sure that more homes are built. As your guests were pointing out, if we're going to reach the levels of house building that we need, of course we're going to have to rely on the private sector, on house builders and developers, but we're also going to have more homes for social rent being built as well. And we're bringing forward legislation which is designed to ensure that that happens.
Secretary of State, I want to talk about house building for private purchase and for private rent and other issues in this interview, but I do think we should kick off on social housing. You have made a succession of major speeches on social housing, and you said the need for more social housing, council housing, is an urgent cause whose time has come. It's also politically quite savvy, isn't it? If you put social housing, the building of more social housing, at the centre of your levelling up strategy, you can retain or try to retain some of those red wall seats.
Well, I think it's just a matter of social justice overall to ensure that we have a variety of different routes which allow people to have a safe, warm, decent home. Naturally, as a Conservative, I'm in favour of home ownership, but I'm even more in favour of everyone who needs to having a place that they can bring up their family in comfort and in safety. And we're never going to get the numbers of houses being built that this country needs unless we have social housing built alongside the housing that the private sector will deliver. And I know that in the past the view has sometimes been taken that Conservatives are somehow indifferent or even hostile to the principle of social housing. Not at all. It is absolutely the case that we need social housing, not just to get those numbers being built, but also so that people can have security of tenure and they can also pay an affordable rent, which allows them to save for the deposit if they wish to own in due course.
There are over 1 million people on the council house waiting list, as you know, 500,000 in temporary accommodation that's unsanitary or otherwise unsuitable. It is a proper issue with lots of human suffering. Council house building, of course, fell during the 80s when you and I were cutting our political teeth during the Right to Buy scheme of Margaret Thatcher, but it absolutely flatlined during Blair, Brown, Cameron and May. What's the main obstacle, Michael Gove, to getting more council housing built? Because the alternative is that we keep spending tens of billions now, over £30 billion, on housing benefit. Basically, the state, the taxpayer, funding buy-to-let empires of social landlords, privately run houses, and those social landlords, as you all know, they often don't provide accommodation that is suitable or even sanitary.
You're absolutely right. It's not right to have a system which basically transfers wealth from hard-working taxpayers to landlords in the private rented sector who are not providing decent homes. It is clearly the case that it is both more equitable and more efficient to use the resource that we have in order to get building. Now, there are several things that we hope to do and which the legislation going through the House of Commons will allow us to do. One is we can reform some of the rules on compulsory purchase to make it easier for local authorities and for the government in order to capture land at an appropriate price so that more of the value and the uplift of that land is captured by the public sector and not in the hands of the landowner. The other thing that we also need to do is to make sure that the planning regime allows local authorities and others to build communities more quickly and more easily. And the third thing is that we need to make sure that our new infrastructure levy, which will replace Section 106, which is the sort of negotiation between local authorities and developers, this new infrastructure levy will, I think, have to be devoted in large part to the provision of more affordable social housing.
A lot of people working in local authorities tell me, Secretary of State, that one of the biggest barriers they have is if they spend local authority money, all the rigmarole, building those social homes, they then have to sell them back to tenants if they spark the right to buy within a couple of years. And the money, the proceeds from that sale, then 4/5 of them, as you know well, go back to the Treasury. So the local council doesn't even get the money back to build a new social home. That's a major problem, isn't it?
It is a challenge. We do need to make sure that when people exercise the right to buy, that local authorities and other social landlords have the wherewithal to be able to replace the housing stock that has gone into the private sector that is now in the hands of tenants who become owners. And we need to make sure there is a one-for-one, like-for-like replacement. And that's a message that's well understood by Treasury ministers and by the Prime Minister, and we're exploring and discussing how we can ensure that when local authorities and registered social landlords do build more, and indeed do extend the right to buy for people who wish to own, that we can have an adequate and suitable replacement of the housing stock. That's critical.
And that is key, isn't it? Because the right to buy revolution of the 80s, a lot of the housing wasn't replaced, and that's why lots of people opposed it, though for many of the families concerned, of course, it was life-changing. Let's move on to the private sector, if you like, the house builders who dominate this industry. You've described them, Secretary of State, and they deny this, of course. You've described them as a cartel. Do you think that word was justified?
Yes, I do. I think a proper economist like you, Liam, would probably prefer the term oligopoly. But in essence, what we have is a situation where, since the economic crash of 2008, we've seen more and more of the homes that have been delivered being delivered by a small group of big volume house builders. And one of the problems with that is that we don't have a market that is truly competitive. There are barriers to entry. One of them is the planning system, which means that smaller builders, artisan builders, have been locked out of the system. And it's also meant that the developers have been doing a number of things which, to my mind, and I'm not criticising them, it's my responsibility to change the system, but they've been doing a number of things which haven't exactly worked wholly in the public interest. There's been manipulation of the land market in order to keep prices at a particular level. And it's also been the case that some volume house builders have been producing homes that are identikit and shoddy and low quality. And what we need to do is to make sure that we have both proper planning reform that allows more market entrance, but also to take a wider look at the way in which the land and housing market works in order to make sure that it is working in the interests of the citizen, not those people who are currently profiting handsomely.
These are strong words, Secretary of State, as you will well know. The housing industry, the house building industry, they will vehemently reject you calling them a cartel, because, of course, cartel behaviour is illegal. We're already at the point where the House of Lords, back in 2016, when they did a detailed report, said our house building industry, though, has got all the characteristics of an oligopoly. I guess you agree with your predecessor, Sajid Javid, who said the big house builders have got a stranglehold on the market and they're deliberately building slowly. If all this is your view, and I know other ministers feel the same way, why don't we see a Competition and Markets Authority investigation into our house building market? The last one was in 2008, before that financial crash, which caused the house building industry to consolidate so much. It strikes me that CMA investigation is long overdue, Secretary of State, and some people would say, not just housing campaigners, but academics and other analysts too, that the Tory party's worried about doing a CMA inquiry on the big house builders because of the relationship between our political class and campaign donations from developers. How would you respond?
Well, I think anyone who's looked objectively at the positions that I've taken since I became Secretary of State would, I think, fairly conclude that I'm in nobody's pocket. The building safety crisis required me to say to the major developers that they had a responsibility to remediate the properties which they had helped to develop, but also to contribute more broadly towards dealing with that crisis. Now, the major developers objected initially, though they accepted, actually, that leaseholders shouldn't pay, and we got them to cough up. In that process, some chief executives of the major developers and the major house builders used some salty language to describe my approach, but I was absolutely convinced that was the right thing to do. And when it comes to looking at the housing market more broadly, then no option is off the table. And I know that you and others have written and argued for a CMA review. Again, I won't go into the details of what the department is proposing or thinking of. It would be wrong to preempt any announcement that might be market sensitive in any way. However, it is the case that we are looking at a range of options in order to ensure that we can have a better functioning market. Now, as I say, I'm not criticising any individual. People in any industry will behave rationally in order to maximise the return for their shareholders and investors. It's up to government to make sure that the regulations that prevail and the approach towards competition that exists is pro-consumer and pro-citizen. So, there's nobody to blame ultimately but myself for this situation if it is perpetuated, and that is why, as I say, we need to change.
You have a deserved reputation, if I may say so, Secretary of State, as being a very analytical politician. You're a details man. You must have looked at lots of detail before you used a word like cartel, and you used it just again on live television. Were you looking at things like the fact that a lot of our house builders are building on 25 or 30% margins, huge profit margins? Were you looking at the fact that some housing executives are getting double-digit £1 million annual bonuses? Are you looking at the fact that the average house now costs 9 or 10 times average earnings, whereas when you and I bought our first properties, it was more like 2 or 3 times average earnings? What was it that led you, Michael Gove, to use that word cartel? Because that's a really big move for you to use a word like that.
Well, I think it's important that everyone recognises that we in government are aware that the situation at the moment is insupportable. And ultimately, I want to see a healthy housing market with developers and builders, both volume house builders, but also smaller artisan builders, all contributing to more homes being built. But it's also important that the homes that are built are beautiful and attractive and high quality. It's critically important that we get infrastructure alongside those homes. It's also important that we have developers working with communities in order to ensure that there's democratic consent for building, and important also that environmental concerns are taken into account. At the moment, all of those aims or goals are achieved, if at all, imperfectly, and that is a situation that needs to change. And as you quite rightly point out, when you've got an oligopoly, when you've got a concentration of market power, then it's up to government to look to see how we can reform that market to get it to work better in the interests of citizens.
The Conservatives have just lost the Wakefield by-election, of course, as well as Tiverton and Honiton. What do you think that Wakefield result says about levelling up? Is it more than a slogan?
It's much more than a slogan. And of course, my congratulations to the two candidates from Labour and the Liberal Democrats who won the by-elections, and my commiserations to the Conservative candidates who fought brave and good campaigns. I think that the result in Wakefield is a reminder to us that we need to move further and faster on levelling up. We need to show the people who supported the Conservatives in 2019 that we're making the changes, securing the investment, prioritising the policies that will help them through the economic hard times that we're facing, and guarantee a brighter future. And there are a number of things that government has done, everything from boost research and development spending to change the way in which the Arts Council funds culture in order to reinforce and to emphasise the fact that we need to extend opportunity so that it's not just London and the South East that is the engine of the economy firing on all cylinders, but every part of the United Kingdom is contributing to growth.
How will your party, if you like, get your arms around the two sections of society that you now need to retain your majority, the Tory shires, the so-called blue wall, and the red wall across the North and the Midlands, seats you won for the first time in many cases in 2019. Isn't there a danger, Michael Gove, that the Conservative Party, which many people view as the natural party of power, given your longevity over the years, isn't there a danger that you fall between two stools?
Well, I absolutely accept this sort of characterisation of different parts of the country that commentators use, and I completely understand that. But from my point of view, we should be thinking about policies that help all parts of the United Kingdom. So if it is the case that we strengthen economic growth and productivity in the North, the Midlands and the South West, that takes some of the pressure off the green fields of the South East and the public services in the South East. So in that sense, a policy of promoting more equitable growth across the whole of the United Kingdom helps every part of the United Kingdom. But more importantly, whether someone is living and working in Surrey or in Devon or in Yorkshire, then what they want to see is an effective government that is concentrating on making public services more efficient and is concentrating also on helping people to get and stay in a good job and then find a decent home and have the prospect of good educational outcomes for their children. And that is what the government is focused on.
It seems pretty useful for the Prime Minister that that vote of the 22 committee happened some weeks before those by-election results, wouldn't you say? Surely, if that vote had happened after those two by-election losses, the result may have been different.
I don't think so. Again, one of the things is that commentators and journalists will quite rightly speculate about all sorts of aspects of political life. But from the point of view of someone who's working in government, that vote happened. The Prime Minister won. I voted for him. I was delighted that he won. It was a clear victory. And now, as the Prime Minister has said, it's our responsibility, Minister's responsibility, to get on with delivery. And I think that speculation exists when there is a desire on the part of some to focus on the Westminster rumour mill. Entirely understandable. But ministers have a responsibility not to get sucked into that rumour mill. Ministers have a responsibility to get on with delivery. So, making sure that our Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, the changes to the planning system and so on, are pushed through, making sure that people see that, I'm earning my daily crust by thinking hard about how we can improve the housing market and making sure that more people can get on the property ladder.
Some people are even speculating that allies of the Prime Minister put those letters in, MPs to the 22 committee chair, in order to spark the vote earlier. I mean, I might say that as a former chief whip. I'm sure that you couldn't possibly comment. So let's go back to housing, because you'll know, Michael, that across the country, not just in leafy parts of the southeast, but across the country, many households, many families, as an alternative to pension saving, will have bought one buy-to-let property, maybe a property that they previously owned and then they didn't sell as they moved. And for many people, not wealthy people at all, not people with buy-to-let empires, I think the average buy-to-let landlord has less than two properties, something like 1.4. So we're talking about people of modest means. A lot of them are feeling hammered by your recent white paper, Fairer Rented Sector, given the additional costs that these small-scale landlords will encompass. And they're often very, very good, well-meaning landlords who look after their tenants, who are often long-term. The introduction of restrictions on the no-fault evictions. What would you say to some of them who are natural Conservative voters, Michael Gove, who are concerned that you're hammering small-scale buy-to-let landlords who are just trying to save as an alternative to pension savings, given the demise of occupational pensions, given the volatility of financial markets, given very, very low interest rates, which makes it very, very difficult for ordinary people to save?
There's so much in there, and you make a number of very good points. The first thing I would say is that you're right. The overwhelming majority of landlords are good landlords, good people who have made a rational decision about how to invest their savings and provide a great service for their tenants. That's the overwhelming majority. But there are some poor landlords in the private rented sector. There are some homes in the private rented sector that are very poor quality, and we do need to take steps to improve that quality. It is also the case that if you look at what's happened in the housing market over the last more than 10 years, what we've seen is the private rented sector grow and at the same time home ownership diminish. So one of the things that I would say is that if it is the case that there are some landlords who do sell their properties, then that is an increase in housing supply. It can be of benefit to first-time buyers if we see that market expand in that way. But it is also the case that the legislation that we are bringing forward which was in our manifesto, will ensure that those who remain in the private rented sector can be guaranteed a decent home, have their rights protected. And it is also the case that if you do have, as a landlord, a tenant whom you do need to evict, then we will make sure that the justice system supports you if that tenant is behaving in an antisocial manner, and it's right for you to get them to move on.
I want to ask you, Secretary of State, about some other aspects of your brief. You will be acutely aware of the geopolitical importance of energy security and so on. A lot of people in your party, particularly in the House of Commons, are talking about the need to lift that government moratorium on fracking. And you seem to have annoyed Jim Ratcliffe, who is the boss of the energy giant INEOS. He's apoplectic that permission for a fracking site in South Yorkshire has been rejected, and the justification your department has given is something to do with the Greenbelt. The Greenbelt covers 13% of the English landmass, Secretary of State. All houses cover less than 2%, including gardens. Don't we need to get fracking?
Well, you're quite right. There is a moratorium on fracking at the moment, and ultimately a decision on fracking and other forms of energy supply is above my pay grade. But I would say two things. The first thing is that the decisions that are taken by my department, much above my pay grade, decisions that are taken by my department are decisions where ministers look at the evidence produced by inspectors and exercise a quasi-judicial role in accordance with the law as it stands. And on the same day that a minister in this department made that decision, that same minister also gave the go-ahead for exploratory drilling in my own county of Surrey. I'd recused myself from that decision-making, but it's important to stress there is a balance here. But more broadly, without getting into the moratorium on fracking per se, I do think that in the light of war in Ukraine, we do need to look at energy policy overall, and the Prime Minister and Kwasi have. And I think we do need to recognise that hydrocarbons are going to have to be part of our energy future for some time to come. Obviously, we want to transition towards more energy coming from renewables. We need to invest in hydrogen technology. We need more nuclear as part of the mix as well. But you are right to point out that because of the situation in Ukraine, and indeed because of broader insecurities in the world economy and in the energy markets, we do need to look to our own shores to see what more we can do domestically in order to diversify our energy supply.
Last couple of questions, if I may. Even in Germany, Secretary of State, where the Greens are part of the coalition in power, they have dropped renewable subsidies on household fuel bills. Now, a lot of my viewers and listeners will know that 25% of what they're paying for their electricity at the moment goes on renewable subsidies, often to big landowners, often to big energy companies. Isn't it time to at least suspend those renewable subsidies on household fuel bills? And isn't it time to take VAT off household fuel bills while you're at it, which was promised during the Brexit referendum?
Well, they're both intriguing propositions, but I'm going to shamelessly duck the question on the basis that these are really matters for the PM, the Business Secretary and the Chancellor. And they're all much smarter than me, much more across the detail of all of those questions. And they wouldn't thank me if I were to start outlining what VAT policy or what, for that matter, renewables policy would be. So I know it's always irritating when politicians don't answer the question direct, but I'm not really allowed to venture into that territory, for reasons of collective responsibility. So I can't see you. You may well be rolling your eyes. There may be folk at home who are throwing things at the telly. I can only apologise, but at least I'm being honest and saying that I am ducking that question.
How out of character for you to duck a question, Michael Gove. But anyway, let's see if you duck this one. Famously, you were campaigning for Boris Johnson to become leader in 2016. Then you famously started uncampaigning for Boris Johnson to become leader. And you talked about his character at the time. His character is now absolutely centre stage in our politics. I guess you've changed your mind.
Yes, you've got a wonderful turn of phrase. I think It's very gentle of you to say that I was campaigning for him and then I was uncampaigning for him. No, I withdrew my support for Boris in 2016, and with the benefit of hindsight, that was a mistake. I think that I should have supported him throughout that leadership election. I voted for Boris in 2019 when there was a straightforward choice between Boris and Jeremy Hunt. I'm a great fan of Jeremy's, actually, but I thought that Boris was the right person at that point to be Prime Minister, and I think he's the right person to be Prime Minister now and well into the future. I think that on our handling of COVID, in particular, but not exclusively, the vaccination and booster programme, Boris's judgment has been vindicated. I don't think anyone could have broken the Brexit impasse in the 2017-2019 Parliament in the way that he did. And more recently on Ukraine, I think his leadership has been inspirational. So I'm perfectly happy to say that I got that one wrong. Generally, if I have made a mistake, I prefer to acknowledge it. There may be other mistakes that you want to bring up that I've made in the past, but that was definitely a big one.
Michael Gove, Housing Secretary, Levelling Up Secretary, good to have you with us here on The Money. We're grateful to you for your time today and for your mostly frank responses to our questions. Michael Gove there, what do you make of that? Helen, you've worked at the top of politics. You used to advise some bloke called George Osborne. Don't know what happened to him. What did you make of what you just heard?
I thought you said he was mostly candid. I thought he was extremely candid. I mean, I think even in that response of he didn't want to answer it was the point being he can't. It is for the Prime Minister, etc. And he's clearly very close to them, and he'll know a lot of their thinking. But I thought a remarkably candid interview that covered a lot of different areas. We all know he's very much across his brief. He is a policy guy, gets things done.
He's not scared to take questions, is he? I mean, that was a long interview.
No.
It's not often a cabinet minister will do a live 20-minute interview, so hats off to him.
Well, hats off to you, because if I might say so, it's not so often that they actually get questions from someone who understands economics and the detail of a policy, and they need more of that. We all need more of that as a country. I do hope people are responding to you on Twitter about some of the detail on that, because for so long we shriek headlines, but the details matter of how to get change done, and I think that's what we've heard today.
Helen, I'm sure we'll discuss the ramifications of that interview in the days to come. Great to have you on the show. Thank you so much. Now, last week, the UK's rail network also almost ground to a halt, of course, as thousands of rail workers went on strike, protesting for better pay and working conditions. But the industrial action doesn't stop there, because today, criminal barristers have voted to strike in an escalating dispute with the government over legal aid funding. Our East of England reporter, Ed Crawford, is outside Ipswich Crown Court for us. Hi, Ed, what's the mood? Striking barristers, what next?
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, well, there's not much of a mood here because the barristers aren't here. What I can tell you is today, as you said, is the first day of the barristers going on strike. There's a walkout today and a walkout tomorrow, and they're going to be adding walkouts every day subsequent weeks until the culmination of their protest, which is a 5-day walkout. And as you said, this is over a dispute on legal fees. So back in November, Sir Christopher Bellamy submitted a report to the Ministry of Justice, and within that report, that 160-page document, it recommended that legal aid be risen by 15% and that it must be reviewed each year. Unfortunately, the government haven't got round to rising that, and that has forced the barristers' hand into taking the movements that they have today. So we know there is a backlog in the courts. We know it's going to get worse with barristers going on strike. In fact, the most recent figures from Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service show there are more than 350 outstanding cases at the magistrates and more than 58,000 outstanding cases at the Crown Courts. Now, this backlog isn't going away anytime soon. So I thought I would speak to Simon Spence QC about the pandemic's impact on the court system, the backlog of cases, and why is there a staffing crisis within the court cases?
Backlog is currently 60,000 or thereabouts. It's in the high 50s. What people don't appreciate is that even before the courts closed, they weren't running to maximum capacity because of underinvestment. So there was already in the system a 30,000 backlog of cases. That has now doubled because of COVID, and also because, although the courts have reopened, they're still not operating at full capacity. Barristers are leaving the profession in droves because they're not able to make a decent living from the work they do, and they're finding alternative sources of employment, either different areas of law which are privately paid or leaving the law altogether. And we're getting to a crucial point where there isn't sufficient manpower, either in terms of lawyers, judges and court staff. So even if you wanted to go back to full capacity, there aren't enough people to do it. And we think that's a major problem for the future.
So yes, that's Simon Spence there, and his remarks are echoed by the CBA, who have also said that there is currently an alarming exodus of criminal barristers leaving the system, and that the system is teetering on the brink of collapse. Now, the barristers are holding the iron to the government's feet, and in the light of their demands, the government's Justice Minister, James Cartledge, has agreed to a £7 pay increase for criminal barristers, but that was not due to be implemented till September. He went on to say, "We encourage the Criminal Bar Association to work with us rather than escalate to unnecessary action, as it will only serve to harm victims as they are forced to wait longer for justice." So, unfortunately, with no conclusion in sight, it seems like the barristers will be taking their fight from the courtroom to the picket line.
From Ipswich. Thanks a lot, Ed. Good to have you on the show. Now, as On the Money's been covering for a long time, the cost of living's rising at an alarming rate. Fuel and food are at the top of the inflationary table, and costs look set to climb further, unfortunately, in the next few months. Our Northern Ireland reporter, Dougie Beattie's been finding out the links in our food chain.
When your food costs continually rise, your economy has a real problem. Here at the cattle market, the building blocks of our food go under the hammer. The auctioneer is putting through animals that are at the end of their dairy life. Their milk yield is down, they're not producing any more calves. This is the type of stuff that will go into ready meals, processed food, and even now, this is going for up to $1.90 a kilo. This price would have been near the cost of quality beef just a short while ago. Agriculture Minister Edwin Poots says it's the cost of fuel that's driving prices high.
Well, the last time we had a spike in oil prices was in 2008, when oil went to $145 a barrel, and at that stage fuel was around $1.20 a litre. Agricultural fuel was less than 50 pence a litre. We now have a situation where oil is $120 a barrel, and yet fuel is around £2 a litre and agricultural fuel around $1.30 a litre. So oil is a big issue here. It's driving up the cost of fertiliser, it's driving up the cost of other inputs such as meal, and consequently that will drive up all food costs.
Colin McKee is a businessman that is trying to produce quality and quantity and keeping costs down by going from farm gate to plate.
We farm here. We finish cattle, we finish lambs, we work with chickens, we don't keep our own hens. So we are really producing from the farm to the shop, to the table.
Continental cattle such as Charlies, Limousines or Belgian Blues produce better beef weights, but need barley or grain as opposed to grass to bring them to their full potential. Scenes like this used to be commonplace across the UK. Barley was one of the most stable diets for finishing off high-yielding beef cattle. But cheap imports of grain and wheat from outside the EU allowed feed manufacturers to produce much more cost-effectively.
The UK is not self-sufficient in terms of grain, so it's going to be important from Canada, North America, Ukraine and Brazil. So that's still going to be needed.
There's deer feed going into cattle that were deer bought, and then that's going to be slaughtered and then put into a shop. It's going to be expensive, you know, and it's getting the customer, are they going to be able to afford to buy it?
An economy such as the UK, with its own currency and fiscal levers, may be more nimble in the global markets, but to take full advantage, it must have control of its own raw materials. Dougie Beattie, GB News.
Dougie Beattie there. It's time now for my daily interview series, Money Talks, and our guest is Nigel Mills Cbe, co-founder of one of England's leading whisky distilleries. Nigel started his career as a chartered accountant before a chance break saw him buy a business from a family friend. That sparked his entrepreneurial spirit, and he went on to build several successful businesses in the fields of convenience retail, property investment and hotels. But there's one project that's particularly close to Nigel's heart. In 2011, he founded the Lakes Distillery, manufacturing spirits such as single malt whisky, blended whisky, gin and vodka. Over the last decade, that distillery's grown from strength to strength, becoming one of Cumbria's leading tourist attractions and obtaining a value of around £100 million. So here he is, Nigel Mills Cbe, my latest guest on Money Talks. Nigel, great to have you with us, joining us down the line from Cumbria. I'm sorry we haven't got more time. I'm sorry you're actually in the northeast of England, in Newcastle. I should declare that you did actually send a bottle of your whiskey. I'm allowed to show it on TV because I'm not actually drinking it. I think Nigel's actually... Are you still there, Nigel? Can we still see you? Oh, what a shame. We've lost Nigel Mills after that long interview with Michael Gove. Well, let's talk instead to Darren. Darren, you are the founder of a business called ProPod in Portsmouth, and these are rental accommodations that you rent out to professional people. And the reason I got you on the show and wanted to talk to you is there seems to be an issue with council tax that's undermining your ability not just to build the business, but to solve some rental problems, some rental gaps in the market for professional people down there on the south coast. Can you explain this council tax issue?
Yeah, so we are a HMO co-living specialist in Portsmouth, and approximately 2-3 years ago, we started notice that our bedrooms that the tenants rent individually were starting to get banded individually for council tax. And that's roughly adding between £75 and £100 a month to their rental bill. It's huge. It's massive. We believe this is not just happening in Portsmouth. This is happening up and down the country. We think it's averaging between 15 and 19% extra.
I'm trying to get my head around this. Look, if a bunch of people rent a home, right, they pay the council tax between them.
That's right.
Why is it that the valuation office, in the case of some of your properties that your business has developed and put on the market as rental accommodation, why are they charging your tenants, your renters, individual council tax on each bedroom, which of course adds up to much more?
Because they have their own tenancy agreement.
I see.
It's as simple as that. Because
that's part of your business model. It's like a bespoke service tenancy agreement.
That's right. You know, so whilst we are a co-living house and everyone shares facilities, there could be 6 or 7 different individuals who maybe don't know each other but moving into the area, and they have their own tenancy agreement, but they don't have the complete facility. So they don't have an ensuite and a kitchen in
and the living room and the kitchen, they're still shared accommodation. There's one front door, even though they may have locks on their bedroom, right?
Exactly. There's one front door. We pay the gas and electric because there's only one utility supply to the property. So, yeah, we're noticing this is a huge problem for tenants. And, you know, I saw you had Michael Gove on earlier, and it's something that we've been trying to lobby the government for about the last 9 months to say, this isn't correct. And my concern is, from what we understand, is once these bedrooms get individually rebanded for council tax, we understand they get added to the UK housing numbers.
Unbelievable. So
from what we understand.
Well, this is a subject close to my heart. Housing completions are one thing, and you know, if I'd had an hour with the Secretary of State, we could have really got into these weeds. But new dwellings are another. So what you're saying is that valuation offices locally are splitting up rented houses into separate accommodation, and then the government can add, that's 4 new dwellings in a 5-bedroom house.
From what we understand, that's how we believe it happens. And then I think where the scary thing comes is that they don't meet national space standards. So we've got bedrooms that are 12, maybe 15 square metres.
But that doesn't count as a house or a dwelling?
That doesn't count as a house because the national space standard minimum is 37 square metres across most of the country. So, yeah, this is a huge concern for us. We are actively lobbying government. At this moment in time, we're struggling to get any traction. But we believe that this is not just technically wrong, it's morally wrong. And we hear about levelling up and, you know, the Renters Reform Bill coming in. Well, there's no mention in there about shared livers.
And it seems to me quite interesting. Somebody called Penny Mordaunt, who's Minister of Trade in this government, you know, senior political figure. Some people would tip her as a future leader. She's actually helping you. She is going into bat. I came across you because I saw her tweeting about this, that one of her constituents, she's the proud Portsmouth MP,
she is
having this issue. Can she help you?
We hope so, and we're grateful for Penny, and we're also grateful for Caroline Dinich, because she's raised this in the Levelling Up Bill in Parliament as well.
Another local MP,
Another local MP. We've recently written to all 17 members of the Levelling Up Committee to ask this to be looked at as part of the evidence, so to speak, for the bill. But it's something that we're passionate about. We don't think it's right, and we think, actually, by stopping people sharing properties and having rooms within properties, we're actually freeing up local housing stock. So 1 and 2 bedroom properties are being freed up, because the majority of people who maybe, in our instance, in our company, who share, they travel 80 miles or more to take a job in Portsmouth. So they could only
There's a lot going on the South Coast.
There's a lot going on the South Coast, you know, but they could only be in Portsmouth maybe for 3 or 6 months.
Darren, I'm going to investigate this story. You are going to come back on the money, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. I'm sorry the time is truncated today. You can blame the Housing Secretary. Darren Brewer of Pro Pods. Good luck in your business, and we will talk again soon. That's all we've got time for today, but join me tomorrow at 1 p.m, where we'll be talking about lots of things, not least the aftershocks from that interview with Michael Gove. This is GB News. I'm Liam Halligan, and that was On the Money.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV. On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you. We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there.